Good afternoon. My name is Kimberlyn Kakuzin. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a second year student majoring in health information science. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Algonquin people, traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and pay my respect to their elders past and present. Today I'll be discussing my perspective of how social determinants of health interact with health inequalities from an intersectional perspective. The health and wellness of people is beyond the individual. Our health is a reflection of our collective environment, whether that's social, political, or physical environment. Our health is more than our genetic makeup, rather, it mirrors our social positioning in society. Our social positioning is established by various factors that is socially constructed, such as our social categories like race, class, sexuality, just to name a few. Our health is also a reflectance of the social determinants that we face in the daily, which includes our access to healthcare, schools, education, the national and global unequal distribution of goods and power. These social determinants limit our chances of living a healthy life. The social determinants that we face in our life acts as barriers that places in a system of power in society, which cultivates health inequalities. The effect of social determinants is detrimental to an individual's health, as living in society has psychosocial demands that require people to participate in their social, economic, and their political life. And since social categories are socially constructed, social determinants such as gender, occupation, socioeconomic status, race, these all impact health outcomes. As well, it generates hierarchies of health and illness that is discriminatory against the racialized, marginalized, and low socioeconomic communities. Today, to illustrate the conceptual relationship between social determinants and health inequality in an intersectional perspective, we will be looking at the impact of social determinants of health for Indigenous women who were forced of sterilization. In Saskatchewan, Indigenous women experience discrimination by prohibiting the right to make their own decisions concerning their bodies. These women were not informed that tubal ligation is permanent and had a sterilization procedure performed without their consent. And based on the interview that was held, the healthcare providers that the healthcare providers that provided these sterilization procedure held negative perceptions and attitude toward Indigenous women. They willingly ignored and viewed the needs of these Indigenous women as insignificant, and in addition to performing the unwanted procedures. So in this example, these Indigenous women are oppressed for their gender, for being a woman, their race, for being an Indigenous person, and their access to healthcare has been abused and marginalized. The social determinants, all in all, the social determinants of being an Indigenous woman in society has had negative consequences, as racism has racial social impact. These racist remarks are usually linked with stigma in the indigenous communities. And due to the distress of traumatizing past of residential schools, colonization, the ongoing cycle of oppression, studies shown that indigenous communities have a high risk have a high risk of excessive drug and alcohol use, um, and these the studies indicate that these drug and alcohol use are usually associated with the sexual, physical, emotional, and mental abuse that these attendees experience in residential school. So many indigenous individuals are often stigmatized for being an alcoholic, a drug addict, for being poor or uneducated. And these racist and stigmatized assumptions has led to health inequalities. Um, the negative perception of mainstream society against indigenous people have negative consequences that add to the cycle of oppression that continues to victimize the indigenous community, influencing their quality of care in the healthcare system due to the prejudice misconceptions made. This also creates a system of abuse within healthcare as well. It creates mistrust between the healthcare and indigenous people. Um, the unsettling experience the of these indigenous women who faced sterilization without consent, it was far from their control. The systemic racist policies and care in the healthcare system, their race, their class, their gender, their access to quality care, these all intertwine as their social determinants, and that is the cause of the racial health disparities that they experience. Um, However, the experience of these indigenous women are not the first. This is an ongoing problem as Brian Sinclair, an indigenous man who was seeking for medical care, was completely ignored due to the racist assumption that he was homeless and or intoxicated. Healthcare providers neglected his needs, allowing him to die in plain sight of the Canadian healthcare system. Um, Sinclair's experience within the healthcare system was a result of racism and lack of empathy certain healthcare providers had who refused to care for an Indigenous person. The cycle of oppression continues for Indigenous communities as negative mainstream misconceptions are overlooked in systems such as healthcare, education, and workplace. But this is not surprising as our own federal government has created these very unequal healthcare policies for Indigenous people that are discriminatory against their group. For example, communities in the Northwest Territories experience prejudice from the Canadian government. The indigenous people, including the First Nation, the Inuit, the Métis, populate over half of the Northwest Territory. And although the healthcare spending in this territory is double the Canadian average per capita, the Northwest Territory has one of the lowest life expectancies in Canada for Indigenous individuals. The federal government transfers First Nation. That's because the that's because the federal government transfers the First Nation specific healthcare funding to the territorial government, and that explains for the lower life expectancy as this adds bureaucratic layer that limits Indigenous communities to control their own health care. This restricts their decision making and healthcare delivery for their community. Um, in conclusion, by understanding the intersectionality of the structural racism and in stigma and sociopolitical factors like the unequal distribution of monetary funds for healthcare for the indigenous communities, we can recognize multiple factors and circumstances constitutes the social determinants of health, and they are responsible for the health inequalities between groups of people.